everyone, and welcome back to today's Quick Take presentation. Today's presentation will be approximately 15 minutes long, and after the presentation's over, we'll go ahead and open the floor up for any questions. Today's Quick Take will be led by Sam Fisher, who is the lead for the StoragePoint team. He is located in Houston, Texas, and has been with Metalogix for 2 years. Thank you everyone for joining, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to Sam.
Hello all. As mentioned, my name is Sam Fisher, and I'm the lead support technician for the StoragePoint product. And today we'll be going over StoragePoint endpoints and BLOB retention. A quick look at the agenda shows that we'll be touching on some background information on RBS, which I think is always an important preface to a StoragePoint demo. The 3 types of endpoints available, those being the system cache endpoint, primary endpoints, and backup endpoints, and we'll be going over endpoint configurations. So let's get right into it. For the RBS background component, we'll discuss at a high level what RBS does and answer the questions, what is the BLOB, what is externalization, and what is shredding? So what does RBS stand for? The acronym RBS actually stands for Remote Blob Storage. Programmatically, RBS is a set of Microsoft SQL Server APIs which enable applications to store blobs outside of the databases. For the purposes of this quick take, the assumed application will be SharePoint. While the metadata for each blob is still stored in the SQL Server database, the blob content is stored in the RBS provider blob store. Also, for the purposes of this presentation, the assumed RBS provider will be, of course, StoragePoint RBS. Since it's exactly this type of content, which tends to take up the bulk of space in SharePoint, moving blob content outside the database itself can have a dramatic effect on the amount of space a content database utilizes, allowing for more manageable maintenance plan windows and cost-effective storage devices for housing the data itself. So we can make assumptions on what the words remote and storage mean, but what is a blob? Within the context of RBS, BLOB is an acronym for Binary Large Object. It's worth mentioning that BLOB is not a data type in the Microsoft SQL Server RDBMS, but rather a packet of binary data that is handled as a series of bytes requiring interpretation. Unstructured data, such as images or various document file types, are managed in this fashion. Documents in a library or attachments to list items fall into this category, regardless of if they are maintained as database content or as an external file. Moving forward in this presentation, the word BLOB will be used to reference the physical externalized file exclusively. If necessary, we'll refer to the binary data still in the content database known as internal content. Without going into detail about specific storage devices, which is definitely a discussion topic on its own, that's about it. Here with the primary endpoints, which in the context of externalized data is a good thing when you think about it. We'll get to the different primary endpoint configuration options in a moment, but circling back to the treating your externalized content as an extension of your content data, I do want to mention that permissions to any of your endpoints are limited to only the admins and service accounts required to if everyone in the organization has permissions to the file system you're using as your endpoint location, sooner or later, bad things are bound to happen. Reiterate something that's already present in documentation, the end-timer address will need full control permissions to whatever storage an endpoint is created upon. While that's true for all endpoints, I wanted to mention it here since this is where your active content. The last have to discuss is the backup endpoint. The backup endpoint defined to maintain copies of the BLOB which exist in BLOB should be compromised. These endpoints should have a longer retention policy than what's been specified for the primary, ideally with a retention period maintained for your content databases. For instance, if you keep your content database backups for 6 months, you may want to keep the backup retention at 80 days. So at any point in time, you could possibly restore a content database from the associated externalized content of it. A backup endpoint will contain at least the amount of data you have in your primary endpoint for any given profile. So storage must be planned for accordingly. If your backup policy is longer than the retention policy, a dynamic profile could be expected to have 3 times as many files. Another recommendation that makes sense is to have your backup endpoint on a separate storage. You have your primaries. If you lose your primary data because the server hosting the file share went down and the backup data is simply in another folder file share, well, I think what the outcome scenario would be. A common with backup endpoints, they play a direct role in, or perhaps even required for, some of our backup products and tools. While our Metalogix products do integrate seamlessly with StoragePoint, the restoration of missing blobs is actually self-managed within StoragePoint via the blob health analyzer job. These backup endpoints are populated via the backup synchronization job, or BSJ for short. The database and location of the primary blob and its backup are maintained in the same database record, right? So basically, for a profile with a backup endpoint defined, when the BSJ loops through the profile and identifies where no backup reference already exists, after doing so, it makes a copy of the blob and writes the backup blob's location to the record for future reference if necessary. I outlined the process. It kind of exemplifies what you cannot do, and I'll mention this. I've seen it more than a couple times. You manually delete the physical blobs from the backup points, assumption that the BSJ will create new copies. Right? Because the job looks for null backup reference values, and because those columns have already been populated, the job has no way of knowing that the backup blobs have been deleted. So endpoint, you make sure you manage the content exclusively through StoragePoint and not through your tenant or through manually accessing them through Windows tools. And as promised, I'll go over some of the possible primary endpoint configurations that can be implemented. Because of the relationship between profiles and some of the options available in terms of targeting specific endpoints to house specific data, there are dozens of possible permutations of how you can configure your endpoints to suit your environment. You can have one endpoint dedicated to a single profile, multiple endpoints dedicated to a single profile. And this is actually already the case simply because of the system cache's existence. You can have many profiles sharing a single endpoint. You can have sharing a single endpoint with designated filters for each profile. You can even have targeting multiple endpoints based on certain filters. A lot of how these configurations were defined was based on preference, and as long as the storage devices could accommodate the chosen configuration, they're really benefit by choosing one configuration over another. At least 0.7, you can now target specific points to execute the unused blob cleanup job against. What this means is that the job has less time collecting the data it needs to process up front, thereby reducing the amount of time it takes to execute. This feature will come in especially useful for those who are concerned about the amount of available space in an endpoint, such as the system cache, right? Now we can run the cleanup job against that one endpoint specifically without spending time addressing orphan content on a storage device where space is an immediate concern. This is where configuration may now become a concept requiring some additional consideration, right? Because if you look at 2 of our more popular configurations, multiple endpoints per profile and single profile using multiple start folders in a single endpoint, we can see how the configuration would affect a job with an endpoint filter. An endpoint filter in the first example would eliminate over 66% of the content the job would need to sift through in order to identify different content needed to be deleted. For example, despite the content being the single endpoint designation would prevent the ability to leverage the endpoint filter and require the job to iterate through all of the profile's content. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to everyone. If not, we're in luck, as that concludes part of this quick take and the opportunity to chat in any questions that you may have. So feel free to do so. While we're waiting for any questions that might be explicitly asked, one of the questions I typically get asked is, can I promote the SharePoint folder name in a synchronous environment? And the answer to that is no, right? Name file promotion to the endpoint is actually exclusive to asynchronous environments. So that's another thing to take into consideration when selecting a processing model. In the event you have no other criteria for what kinds of content get externalized, how important is knowing where the data in the endpoint originated from to you, right? There's another question is there a performance cost when using compression and or encryption on an endpoint? And the answer to that, yes, regardless of how eligible it may be. The degree to how much performance will be affected is actually on a lot of environmental variables, and therefore we can actually benchmark that. But even when it's unnoticed observer, the act of compressing and or encrypting content does require additional steps to process that would otherwise not be there. Yes, that was. And it seems like that was the last question that was posed thus far. If there are no other questions, we'll see as an closing remark. But I will wait for a little bit to see if any more comes through. But I'll take the opportunity to thank everyone for your time and wish you a good day while we're waiting.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone who attended the presentation. This quick take will be soon in the customer portal. If there were any questions that we were able to today, we'll make sure to reach out to you to follow up. We welcome everyone who attended today's webinar to participate in the survey that will be displayed at the end of the webinar. Thank you again for joining and have a great day.